We're always talking about cutting emissions right.
Yeah.
Big polluters, cars, the usual suspects.
Sure.
Power plants.
Yeah, makes sense.
But what about all the other machines that we don't really see every day?
Oh,
The
absolutely.
ones kind of hidden away, doing all the heavy lifting in industries we might not think about all the time.
Right.
They add up, I bet.
They really do. And when we're talking about tackling climate change and reducing emissions, those non-road mobile machines, or NRMM, as they're often called, are a really important piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so NRMM, I have to admit, not something I think about every day.
Right.
What exactly are we talking about here?
Basically, anything that moves and does work, but it's not a car or truck driving on the road.
Okay.
So think about it like this. It could be a big excavator on a construction site, a tractor out in the fields, those giant loaders you see at mines, the forklifts moving stuff around at ports, even some of the heavier duty handheld equipment you might see in different industries.
So pretty wide range of machines then.
Yeah.
And they're all using energy, which often means burning fuel.
Exactly. And this is where it gets interesting, right? Because a lot of these machines have historically relied on diesel or other fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And as we try to move away from those, we need to figure out how to power these essential machines in a cleaner way.
Okay, I'm starting to see the challenge here.
Yeah.
So today we're going deep, a real deep dive into the research paper. It's called Future Energy Technology and Business Factors for Non-Road Mobile Machines.
That's the one.
And I think it's safe to say that this study is our roadmap for this episode.
Hmm.
It lays out a lot of information about the future of energy in this honestly kind of hidden sector.
Absolutely. It's a great resource for understanding the potential of different energy sources and technologies to power NRMM and the business factors that will influence their adoption.
So what we're going to do is try to break down some of the key findings. We'll talk about the different categories of NRMM, how they use energy. The study calls those load profiles, and I think that's an interesting concept we'll get into. And then, of course, we got to talk about those potential energy sources and the new powertrain technologies being developed. And, of course, always important, we'll touch on the business side of things. How much will all this cost? And will it actually make sense for companies to make the switch?
I mean, at the end of the day, it's got to be practical.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what this study really tries to get at. It's not just about the cool new technology, it's about understanding how we can actually make these changes happen in the real world.
The study doesn't just look at things in a vacuum either.
Right.
It considers all sorts of different geographic regions with different climates and how NRM are used in those places.
Yeah, that's key, because what works in one part of the world might not make sense in another.
So it even delves into this super interesting case study about powering mining operations with 100% renewable energy, which I'm really excited to talk about later.
Oh, yeah, that one is fascinating. Really shows what might be possible in the future.
Okay, so to get started, let's talk about the machines themselves. This study breaks down NRMM into three main categories, right, to help us get a better understanding of their energy needs.
That's right.
So first up, we've got agriculture and forestry.
Think about the tractors, combine harvesters.
Right.
Those big forestry machines used to move timber. They often have pretty specific ways they use energy, and sometimes it's tied to the seasons.
Makes sense. You're not going to be harvesting crops year-round in most places.
Yeah.
Then there's the second category, mining and earth moving.
That's your big heavy-duty stuff. Excavators, those massive dump trucks hauling tons of material, different kinds of loaders used in those really demanding environments.
Right. And the third category the study looks at is construction and ports.
That covers a lot of different machines. You've got the forklifts moving things around in warehouses, and the specialized equipment they use to handle really heavy loads, the straddle carriers you see at ports moving those big shipping containers.
So each of those subsectors within NRMM has its own unique set of demands. But something that really stuck out to me in this study is how complex the way these machines actually use energy, those load profiles, as they call them.
Oh, yeah. It's not as simple as you might think.
Right. It's not just like a car driving down the highway at a steady speed.
Exactly. This study really emphasizes that NRMM load profiles can be all over the place depending on what the machine is doing, where it's being used, even the time of year and the specific industry.
So it's not just about how much energy these machines use overall, it's about when and how they use it.
Right. Think of it as their energy fingerprint. Each one's different.
Okay, so can you give us some specific examples of what you mean by that variability?
Well, take underground mining, for example. Those machines might have a pretty consistent load profile, running for long stretches of time at a relatively steady pace.
But then you've got something like those straddle carriers and ports.
Right. They're much more stop and go, with their energy use fluctuating a lot depending on when ships arrive and depart and how much cargo they're moving.
And of course, you've got agriculture, which is so tied to the seasons.
Exactly. Tractors and harvesters might be running full tilt during planting and harvesting, but then sitting idle for months in between.
That's got to make it tricky to figure out the best energy solution for them.
It does. But this study brings up a really interesting idea for dealing with some of that underutilization.
Oh, what's that?
Well, for machines that could be used in both agriculture and in built environments, like, say, certain types of loaders, they suggest that maybe there could be ways to increase how much they're actually being used through things like shared ownership or rental services.
Oh, interesting.
So instead of one farm owning a machine that sits around for most of the year, multiple farms could share it, or there could be a service where they just rent it when they need it.
So make the investment in these potentially pricier, cleaner technologies more worthwhile.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got all these different machines and energy needs, and then this study also looked at a whole bunch of different regions around the world. Why was that so important?
Well, because the potential for different renewable energy sources, what they call RES, varies a lot depending on where you are.
Right.
You're not going to have the same amount of sunshine in Alaska as you do in Arizona.
Makes sense. So they were looking at how the geography affects the energy option.
Exactly. And they considered a wide range of places with different climates, from India to Finland, Dubai to Chile.
So from deserts to forests to places with long, cold winters.
Right. And this let them really understand how the energy demands of NRMM might change in different environments and, more importantly, how the availability of different renewable energy sources could impact those choices.
Okay, that's a really important point. And when it comes to using renewable energy to power these machines, the study focuses on two main pathways, right?
Yeah.
Direct and indirect electrification. Can you break those down for us? What do they mean in this context?
Okay, so direct electrification is basically using electricity directly to power the machine.
Okay, so plug it in, charge it up.
In a nutshell, yeah. Though it might not always be a physical plug, you could have batteries that store the electricity and then power the machine.
So like an electric car, but for an excavator or a tractor.
Exactly. And then indirect electrification is a bit more roundabout. It involves using renewable electricity to create other energy carriers, things like hydrogen or synthetic fuels, what they call e-fuels.
Okay, so still starting with the renewable electricity, but then converting it into something else that the machine can use.
Right. And there's a whole system that they lay out in the study for how this could work. You've got your renewable energy sources like solar panels and wind turbines generating the electricity.
Right.
And then that electricity can be used to either directly charge batteries or it can be used to produce hydrogen through a process called electrolysis.
Electrolysis, that rings a bell from chemistry class.
Basically, you're using electricity to split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. And then that hydrogen can be used in a few different ways. It can power something called a fuel cell, which generates electricity, or it can be combined with carbon dioxide to create those e-fuels.
Okay, so there's a whole chain of energy conversion happening there.
Yeah.
And the study also shows, like, the infrastructure that would be needed for each pathway.
Yeah, you need different things depending on what you're using. Charging stations for battery electric vehicles, production facilities for hydrogen and e-fuels, all that.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of how these machines actually move.
Sure.
We need to talk about powertrains, right?
Right. The system that delivers power to the wheels or whatever makes the machine do its work.
And there are two main types we need to understand, right?
The two that have been around for a while and are still major players are internal combustion engines, those are the ICEs, and then you have electric powertrains, or EPTs.
Okay, so ICE, that's your traditional engine burning fuel, and EPT, that's using electricity to power things.
Exactly. And then, of course, you've got hybrids, which combine elements of both.
Right, the best of both worlds, maybe. We'll get to those later.
Sounds good.
The study had this helpful diagram that shows how energy flows in these different powertrain systems. Can you walk us through that?
Okay, so for a regular ICE powertrain, you start with chemical energy.
Right, that's the diesel fuel or whatever you're putting in the tank.
Right. And then that fuel is burned in the engine, which creates mechanical power to move the machine. For electric powertrains, the energy source is electricity.
Okay.
It's either stored in a battery or generated by a fuel cell, which basically uses a chemical reaction to create electricity from a fuel like hydrogen.
Okay, so the fuel cell is kind of like a mini power plant on board the machine.
In a way, yeah. And then, regardless of where the electricity comes from, it powers an electric motor, which converts that electrical energy into mechanical power to make the machine work.
Okay, so both systems end up delivering mechanical power, but they get there in very different ways. And this study compares those different powertrains to the traditional diesel ICE.
Right, they look at the pros and cons of each option.
And what are some of the biggest takeaways there?
Well, ICE powertrains are reliable, they've been around forever, and they pack a lot of energy into a small space, which is what they call high energy density.
Right, meaning you can fit a lot of fuel in a relatively small tank.
Exactly. But the downsides, of course, are the emissions, the air pollution, and greenhouse
No,
gases.
not good for the environment.
And they're also not as efficient as electric systems when it comes to converting that fuel energy into actual work.
Okay, so electric powertrains have the edge there.
They do. They're much more efficient, and they don't have any tailpipe emissions, which is huge for air quality, especially in places like mines or urban construction sites.
Makes sense. But there are drawbacks to electric powertrains too, right?
Yeah, the biggest one right now is energy density. Batteries just can't store as much energy in the same space and weight as liquid fuels.
So the range might be limited, and it might take longer to recharge them.
Exactly. That's why some people think hydrogen or e-fuels might be better for certain heavy-duty machines that need to run for a long time or in places where you can't easily recharge.
Okay, so it's a trade-off. And the study also looks at how those different energy sources, whether it's electricity, hydrogen, or e-fuels, actually get to the machine, right?
Yeah, that's a really practical consideration.
How do you actually fuel these things up?
Right. For e-fuels, one advantage is that they could potentially use the existing fuel infrastructure.
So the same pipelines, tankers, and gas stations we already have.
Exactly. That could make it easier to switch over. But the downside is that they're currently more expensive to produce.
Okay, so cost is a factor there. What about electricity?
For electricity, you've got a few options. You could have plug-in charging, like with electric cars,
Yeah, just plug it in overnight.
or you could have battery swapping, where you just switch out a depleted battery for a fully charged one.
Oh, that's interesting, like those battery-powered scooters you see in cities.
Right. And then for some stationary or semi-mobile equipment, they might use tethered connections.
Okay, so plug directly into the grid.
Yeah. Each method has its pluses and minuses, depending on what the machine is used for and how much range it needs.
And then there's hydrogen.
Right. If you're using hydrogen fuel cells, you need a whole new infrastructure for producing and distributing the hydrogen.
Which doesn't really exist in most places yet.
Not on a large scale, no. That's one of the hurdles for hydrogen.
Okay, now I want to talk about efficiency.
Good one.
This study looks at what they call well-to-wheel energy efficiency, or WTW, for these different pathways.
Right. So well-to-wheel basically means you're looking at the entire energy chain,
Okay,
from the initial source, like, say, solar energy, all the way to the power delivered at the wheels of the machine.
so it's about how much energy is lost along the way.
Exactly. And what they found is that direct battery electrification is way more efficient.
Really?
Yeah, like around 70% of the energy makes it to the wheels.
Yeah.
Whereas for hydrogen fuel cells and internal combustion engines, it's more like 16% to 24%.
That's a huge difference. So you're getting way more bang for your buck with battery power.
You are, but efficiency isn't the only thing to consider. There's also something called energy density, which we touched on earlier.
Right, how much energy you can pack into a certain volume or weight.
Exactly. And this is where things get a bit tricky because batteries, even though they're efficient, don't have the same energy density as some liquid fuels.
So a diesel tank can hold more energy in the same space than a battery pack.
Right. And that matters a lot for some machines, especially big ones that need a lot of power and need to operate for long periods of time.
So even though batteries are more efficient, they might not always be the best choice if you need a lot of range or power.
It's a balancing act for sure. And the study even points out that for some construction machines, the weight of a battery pack could actually be a good thing because they often use counterweights for stability anyway.
Oh, interesting.
So it's not always a simple equation. You have to look at the specific needs of each application.
Okay, so we've talked about traditional engines, ICEs, and we've touched on electric powertrains.
Mm.
Let's dive a little deeper into those EPTs. What are the different types being used or developed for NRMM?
Okay, so the main ones are battery electric mobile machinery, or BEM, which runs purely on batteries, and an electric motor.
Okay, straightforward enough.
Then you've got fuel cell electric mobile machinery, FCEMM.
So that's using a fuel cell to generate electricity.
Right, typically from hydrogen. And they often have a small battery, too, to handle peak power demands or to store energy from braking.
Okay, kind of like a hybrid within a hybrid.
Exactly. And then there are tethered electric machines, which are basically plugged into the grid.
Right, so they're not as mobile.
No, they're usually for stationary or semi-mobile applications.
Okay, so what are the big advantages of going electric for NRMM?
Well, electric motors themselves are just super efficient. They convert a lot of the electrical energy into usable power.
Right.
And they're very precise. You have good control over the machine's movements and speed. They're generally smaller than comparable combustion engines. And they have good power density.
Okay.
And of course, the zero emissions thing is huge, especially for working in enclosed spaces or in cities where you don't want to be spewing exhaust everywhere.
Makes sense. And the study even gets into the different types of batteries being used.
Yeah, there's a whole world of battery chemistry out there.
They talk about lithium ion, lithium titanate oxide, nickel manganese cobalt, and lithium iron phosphate. Is there one type that's clearly better for NRMM?
It really depends on the application.
Okay.
Some batteries are better for high power, some are better for long life, some are cheaper.
So you have to choose the right battery for the job.
Exactly. And it's the same with fuel cells. They talk about two main types: proton exchange membrane fuel cells and direct methanol fuel cells.
Okay, I'm not going to try to pronounce those acronyms.
Fair enough. But basically, each type has its own strengths and weaknesses depending on what fuel you're using, what temperature you need to operate at, and how much power you need.
Okay, so there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Not really, no. And then there are the hybrids, which we mentioned earlier.
Right, those are interesting,
Yeah.
combining IC and electric.
Yeah, and this study sees them as a good bridge technology,
Okay, meaning what?
meaning they can help reduce emissions in the short term while we're still figuring out the best long-term solutions.
So maybe a stepping stone to full electrification.
That's the general idea. But the study also acknowledges that there are some places, like in the heavy-duty truck industry, where they're kind of skipping the hybrid phase and going straight to fully electric.
Oh, interesting.
So it's possible that we could see that happen with NRMM too as technology improves.
Okay, so we've got a good overview of the different powertrain technologies. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about how the study views the current state of electrification in different NRMM sectors and what research gaps still need to be addressed.
Yeah, good idea.
So where are we at right now?
Well, electric versions of some types of NRMM are already out there,
Okay.
especially smaller stuff like compact tractors and forklifts that are used indoors or in cities.
Right, where emissions are a big concern.
Exactly. And electric loaders have been used in mining for a while now.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it's partly because of the air quality issues in underground mines.
Right, you don't want all that diesel exhaust trapped down there.
Exactly. So they've been using tethered electric loaders for a while to help with that.
Okay, so it sounds like some sectors are further along than others.
That's right. And the study suggests that electrification for NRMM as a whole is probably going to be a gradual process. It might start with just electrifying certain parts of the machine, then moving to hybrid systems and eventually going fully electric.
So a step-by-step approach.
Yeah, but as I mentioned earlier, we might see some areas skipping some of those steps, like we've seen with heavy-duty trucks.
Okay, so the pace of change could vary. What about those research gaps? What are some of the big questions that still need answers?
Well, one thing the study points out is that we don't have great data on the actual working cycles of a lot of NRMM types.
Meaning how they're actually used in the real world.
Exactly. We need more detailed information on how much power they use, when they use it, all that stuff.
Right, if you're going to design a battery-powered machine, you need to know how big the battery needs to be and how often it needs to be charged.
Exactly. And another gap they highlight is that a lot of the research so far has focused on agriculture and mining, but other sectors like ports and material handling haven't gotten as much attention.
So we need to broaden the scope of research.
We do. And they also point out that a lot of the focus has been on hybrid systems, not full electrification.
Okay.
We need more research on things like charging networks and hydrogen refueling infrastructure.
Right, all the stuff that needs to be in place to support a fully electric fleet.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of standardized CO2 emission limits for NRMM.
There aren't any.
Not really, no. And that makes it hard to compare different technologies and track progress.
Okay, so we need a common yardstick to measure things against.
We do. And finally, they highlight a gap in economic analysis.
Meaning what?
Meaning, We need more data on the costs of these different technologies and the total cost of ownership over the lifetime of the machine.
Right, because it's not just about the upfront cost of the machine itself.
Exactly. You have to factor in maintenance, fuel, or electricity costs, all of that.
Okay, so there's still a lot of research to be done.
Huh.
But let's move on to the renewable energy sources themselves. The study highlights solar PV and wind power as the two big ones for NRMM.
Yeah, those are the workhorses.
Why those two specifically?
They're scalable, meaning you can build them at different sizes to fit different needs.
Okay.
And they're becoming more and more widely available. Plus, you can use them in two main ways: directly as electricity to power electric machines, or indirectly to create hydrogen or e-fuels.
Right, we talked about those pathways earlier. And the study looks at the costs of solar and wind power, right?
Yeah, they look at what they call the levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE.
Which basically means the average cost of generating electricity over the lifetime of the technology.
Exactly. And what they find is that the cost of both solar and wind power is projected to keep going down, but especially for solar.
Oh, that's good news.
It is. It means renewable energy is becoming more and more competitive with fossil fuels.
Okay, but solar and wind power aren't always available, right?
That's true. The sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow.
So how do you deal with that variability?
That's one of the big challenges. And the study looks at how that variability plays out in different regions. They have all these charts showing how the output of solar and wind power can change throughout the year in different places.
Right, so you might have a lot of sun in the summer, but not so much in the winter.
Exactly. Or you might have strong winds in the spring and fall, but not much in the summer.
So you have to plan accordingly.
You do, and that's why the study emphasizes the importance of what they call complementarity.
Complementarity, what's that?
Basically, it means combining different renewable energy sources that work well at different times or in different locations.
Okay, so using a mix of solar and wind to smooth out the bumps.
Exactly. And they also talk about demand response, which is basically about getting people to use energy when it's most plentiful.
So shifting your energy use to match the availability of renewables.
Right. That can help make the whole system more efficient and reliable.
Okay, so a lot of moving parts there. And the study identifies some regions that are particularly well suited for solar or wind power.
Yeah, they find that places like the UAE, Brazil, and Australia have great potential for solar PV.
Makes sense, lots of sunshine there.
Right. And places like Finland, the Netherlands, and the U.S. Midwest have good wind resources.
So the best solution really depends on the local conditions.
It does. And they also talk about different ways to supply electricity to battery electric NRMM.
Right, we touched on that earlier.
Yeah.
Plug-in charging, battery swapping, tethered connections.
Yeah, and they discuss the pros and cons of each method.
Okay, and they also look at alternative fuel options for the traditional ICE-powered machines.
Right, because there are still a lot of those out there.
So what are the alternatives?
They talk about things like e-fuels.
Which are basically synthetic fuels made from renewable energy.
All right, they can be drop-in fuels, meaning you can use them in existing engines.
Okay.
Or they can be non-drop-in fuels that might require some modifications to the engine.
And they talk about hydrogen too, right?
Yeah, hydrogen can be used in fuel cells, or it can be converted into other fuels.
Okay, so lots of options on the table.
There are, and then they get into some specific use case examples, starting with agricultural tractors.
Right, because farming is such a big user of these machines.
It is. And what they find is that agricultural systems are really diverse. Different farms have different needs, and the way tractors are used can vary a lot.
Right, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
It's not. And that makes it tricky to come up with a single solution for powering them with renewable energy.
Okay, so what do they suggest?
They think that grid-connected systems with some on-site renewable generation might be the best approach for most farms.
So maybe having solar panels on the barn to supplement the electricity from the grid.
Exactly. And then they look at mining as another case study. They compare mining operations in Finland and Chile.
Oh, interesting. Why those two specifically?
Because they have very different climates and renewable energy resources.
Right, Finland is cold and windy, Chile is sunny and dry.
Exactly. And they find that in Finland, a hybrid system with wind power, solar PV, and battery storage works well. Okay.
But in Chile, a system dominated by solar PV with battery backup makes more sense.
So again, the best solution depends on the local context.
It does. And they even estimate the costs of these different systems, showing that they can be competitive with traditional diesel power.
Okay, so it's not just about the environment, it can also make financial sense.
Right. And then the study wraps up with a discussion section that brings all these findings together.
Okay, let's hear it. What are the big takeaways?
Well, they emphasize that understanding how NRMM are actually used is crucial for figuring out the best way to electrify them.
Right, those load profiles we talked about.
Exactly. And they point out that wind and solar power are going to play different roles in different places.
Right, wind in Finland, solar in Chile.
Exactly. And they also acknowledge that most research so far has focused on hybrid systems, not full electrification, so there's still a lot to learn.
Okay.
But overall, they're optimistic that a transition to renewable energy for NRMM is possible, and that it can make both environmental and economic sense. So a hopeful note to end on. But it's clear that there are still a lot of challenges to overcome.
There are. But this study gives us a good roadmap for navigating those challenges.
It does. And for you, our listener, I want to leave you with a question. Thinking about the world of NRMM and all the different ways they're used, what do you think will be the biggest driver of change in the years to come?
Yeah, what's going to push this transition forward?
Is it going to be advances in battery technology?
Or the falling cost of renewable energy?
Or maybe government regulations?
Or maybe it'll be something completely unexpected.
It's an exciting time to be thinking about these questions.
It is. And the future of NRMM is a big part of the bigger picture of how we tackle climate change.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of energy and sustainability.
See you then.